Hello and welcome to the latest book discussion hosted by Global Policy Journal and the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University, UK. My name is Eva Maria Nag and I'm the executive editor of Global Policy Journal. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Javier Moreno Zacares, assistant professor in political economy at SGIA. Javier's research interests are in two areas: the political economy of housing provision in capitalist economies and the history of capitalist development, theorizing what capitalism itself is. And we're here today to discuss his recent book, Residential Capitalism, Rent Extraction and Capitalist Production in Modern Spain, 1833 to 2023, published by Routledge in 2024. Many congratulations, Javier. Joining us as a discussant is Pedro Araujo at the University of Santiago de Compostela, who has written extensively on political economy, post-Marxism and accumulation theory. Pedro's most recent monograph, entitled Capitalism, Institutions and Social Orders, The Case of Contemporary Spain, was also published by Routledge in 2021, and many congratulations to you as well. So I'd like to start with a question to Javier, as my colleague. Tell us a little bit about your interest in the topic of housing specifically. How does it relate to capitalism and how does it relate to Spain?
Thank you, Eva. Well, housing, I think, sits in an uncomfortable position in capitalist economies at large. So, one thing that we know about capitalism, about the history of capitalist development, is that it tends to cheapen the costs of subsistence. So, with the advance of productivity, with the increase of economies of scale, we have seen an enormous increase in the output of things like textiles or foodstuffs, which are the basis of the costs for producing the workforce. But that hasn't happened with housing, which also happens to be, in general, the largest cost that a household faces in advanced economies, at least. In fact, not only has housing not become cheaper, the real cost of housing has been secularly increasing since at least the late 19th century. And I would venture to say that probably before that as well. So this is a problem, right? Because as I argue in the book, capitalism plows forward by increasing the productivity of subsistence commodities, and that kind of creates a margin for greater consumption. But housing is a basic commodity for subsistence, and at the same time, it keeps getting more expensive over time, which eats into the disposable income of households. So, in a sense, there is a contradictory logic in between capitalist development and the dynamics of accumulation in the sphere of housing. So, that is the role of housing in capitalist economies. Now, that I think is a general issue, but then it assumes country-specific forms depending on the place that a country is in the global division of labor and also the different stage of development. In the case of Spain, what we saw was the formation of a gigantic housing bubble that was coupled with a wave of residential overproduction around which the economy at large had been pivoting since the late 1990s, and the burst of that bubble and the subsequent implosion of the productive economy that had built around it caused a meltdown of historic proportions, which I think we can probably get into a little bit later. So that is the role of housing in capitalist economies and in Spanish capitalism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Pedro, over to you, because I think you're the same generation as Javier, right? And have also sort of explored an interest in capitalism and housing. So, how would you describe your response to what Javier was saying about this crisis? Is that roughly where you also think you want to come into?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me and let me join this conversation. I think Javier and I share the same sort of biological and theoretical concerns. Were both born in the early 90s, so the 2008 crash coincided when we were coming of age. Suddenly, something changed from the years of our teenage or our childhood, and then suddenly we were confronting adulthood, and a sort of entirely different socialist scenario was ahead of us. So, at least in my case, what I wanted to give an explanation to, give a theoretical account to, was that what had changed between the Spain that I had known in my earlier years when I was a child. Everything seems like surrounded by an parallel economic success. In my early 20s, when I was already becoming an adult, I was studying college, and suddenly I was surrounded by rates of youth unemployment over 50%, widespread immiseration and poverty. And I had intuition it was obvious to us that housing had played a big role in it. It had sustained the huge economic boom we had witnessed in our childhood. In our early 20s, it was surrounded by evictions, repossessions, housing, Viking crisis all over the country. So at least my theoretical worry was an attempt to provide an explanation to what had happened and what could be done about it. And I presume that Javier's situation was similar, and his theoretical concerns were also animated by this biographical experience we both share.
Yes, this is really illuminating, I think, because also generations matter, and how cycles of generations experience certain issues that we all confront to a certain extent. And housing, of course, is a key human necessity and a social good. So, can either of you say a little bit more about the specifics of the housing crisis of 2008, and what was so dramatic about it? And who did it affect?
Yeah, it's just to pick up where Pedro's answer left off. I mean, he's absolutely right. We also know each other, so of course he is right. He knows my own background. But yes, I was also born in the early 90s, and I was born into a middle class or lower middle class household. So that strata was the target segment for the ideological complex of that era, which basically was tied progress, or a very vague idea of progress and modernization, with European integration and with essentially forms of neoliberal capitalism, and the promise that this institutional ideological order gave to people revolved around the integration of the middle classes essentially into the regime of accumulation of that time, which was based around financial and real estate speculation. It tried to do so in different ways, like through mass stock ownership, for example. This is something that Thatcher already rehearsed in the UK. But these modes of integrating, let's say, the subordinate social groups into the political economic order were not as successful as the main one, which was housing speculation. So homeowners, and Spain had a very big society of homeowners that had emerged from Franco's dictatorship in the middle decades of the 20th century. They were basically enticed to rely on their asset wealth, on their home asset wealth, to cover their pensions, or basically to complement their incomes derived from wages. And a big part of that was the prospect that house prices were going to continue going up. And a lot of people took a lot of debt to basically meet that prospect. And well, in fact, many people needed to take out debt because banks would only give you a mortgage if you took a certain level of debt, and many people didn't have savings to avoid taking out a mortgage. So there was a compulsion there. It was the only way to access the property ladder. And the prime targets for this system were the middle classes that were encouraged to speculate with their own home assets. And the idea was that you can always sell your house at a higher price and you will reap the benefit of that. But then, of course, that causes a chain reaction, which is that the person that comes after you, you're basically ripping them off for the same house, you're charging them a higher price, and then they are encouraged to do the same with the person beneath them. So throughout the social structure, there is a kind of chain reaction. And then the bottom of that are those that are entering into the housing market for the first time. So they don't have a previous asset that they can sell, so that they can use that as a linchpin to buy a better house. And who are those people that are coming into the housing market for the first time? They tend to be young people, especially young people without inheritance prospects, and they tend to be migrants or just generally poorer segments that were renting. They just didn't have a house to begin with. So these groups, they were excluded from the property ladder, from this speculative game. Although a section of the youth, just to not exaggerate the politics of generation, the prospect of inheriting home assets did cushion the impact. But nevertheless, the youth, migrants, renters, they tended to be those at the sharp end of this arrangement, but they didn't, to be blunt, they didn't matter in the political system so much until the burst of 2007, 2008 came, and it basically, what we witnessed was a process of economic meltdown, political, institutional decomposition, and a wave, an insurrectionary wave, I would call it, from 2011 to 2013 that rocked the country, and that essentially smashed the political consensus that we had witnessed in previous decades. And that, at that moment, that critical moment, is when I, and Pedro as well, came of age. and whole worldviews, the certainties of the previous era were being reorganized, and we were forced to confront with with sober senses the reality of that we had been ushered into, and to rethink the role of housing under capitalism, which was obviously the thing that was igniting this whole thing, and I think of capitalism more broadly.
That was a comprehensive answer. Pedro, do you want to come in?
I agree with everything that Javier has just said. I would just add that it's hard to overstate the role that housing played in like helping reproduce Spanish society during the 1990s and 2000s. Within that, which was widely called around Europe like the Spanish miracle. So the Spanish economy was widely touted all those years on the grounds that the private consumption, the family consumption from households and families was skyrocketing, even if wages were stagnant. Investment was skyrocketing, even if it was mostly real estate. Public deficits were reducing, reaching one of the lowest levels of all European Union countries, thanks to taxes coming from real estate speculation, etc., etc. And also the way that it consolidated a sort of social understanding or social consensus that things were going well, even if problems were already on the horizon. Singularly, wages were not growing at all, but housing prices were skyrocketing again. Except for those excluded groups that Javier just mentioned, from migrants to the youth to those who didn't have a housing to inherit, probably like 70-80% of the population could offset their lack of wage growth through the growing housing prices. In a society where between 70 and 80% of families were owners of the houses they were living in. So that sort of erased a sort of political contestation or political quarrels over those years, which suddenly came to the fore after 2008. So as soon as housing prices could not cover all those imbalances and inequalities, then everything came to the fore. And I agree that an insurrectionary wave that Javier had just mentioned took place during our early 2010s.
Yeah, and it came to an end spectacularly as well, because it wasn't just, oh well, house prices have stagnated now. Now there was like a 36% drop in house prices, sustained throughout 7 years. So from 2008 to 2014, and that is a very sharp contrast with 3-4 decades of sustained real house price increases quite sharply as well. If you look at the chart of house prices in the late 20th century, it's a very sharp increase, very sustained increase, all throughout the advanced capitalist world, of course, but in Spain not least. And I think for the most part, is virtually uninterrupted, vigorous increase in house prices. And then you reach 2008, and there's 7 years of decline. The average house loses a third of its value. So if you are leveraged and you're relying on your house appreciating in value to pay back your debt, now you have a serious problem. You have an issue because your equity is no longer worth that. This dynamic that we're talking about is not unique to Spain, of course. Many countries had housing bubbles in this era, the UK, for example. But there is one thing that was quite peculiar to Spain, which was that the housing bubble happened alongside a construction boom. So in the UK, you have house prices shooting up because there is a decline, or a stagnation rather, in construction levels. So there is a problem of scarcity. And that is the pattern in many countries. In Spain, what you had was a wave of residential overproduction. So you had millions of homes that were being built alongside this house price bubble, and that was fed by a lot of cheap finance that was coming from the eurozone, and that was essentially stretching out effective demand and was generating speculative profits and so on. And then also the arrival of mass migration in this period, in large part to actually furnish the construction industry with labor, was also generating a lot of demand for new housing. So that was kind of the dynamic here. What we have is a housing bubble that is, as Pedro was saying, compensating mainly the middle classes for the stagnation in their wages and for double-digit levels of unemployment, by the way, that this was sustained throughout the economic boom. At the peak years of the boom, you have less than 2 digits of unemployment. But otherwise, mass unemployment is quite common in this era. And then at the same time, what you have is a construction boom that is generating employment, basically, for a lot of migrants and lower strata, Spanish-born poorer segments. So what you have is the decline in house prices sets in motion construction stoppages that cause a massive implosion in the labor market, and that in turn accelerates the mortgage crisis. People cannot pay back their debts, and that leads to an eviction crisis. So what you have is hundreds of thousands of people start losing their homes in a society that was ideologically, economically, and politically founded on the premise and the prospect of home ownership. And all of a sudden, what you have is, and this is happening in our TV screens every day because it was such a scandal in the news, right? You have this public spectacle of people losing their homes and essentially their kind of civic identity in a way. It was that bad, right? And then you see the riots that start to break out. You have like activists that are forming to block evictions, and then the state sends the police, and then you have these like street battles where you have like an 80-year-old lady that is being expelled out into the street because she guaranteed the mortgage of her grandchild, and then you have like 30 activists and her grandchild and whatever, some family members there barricading themselves in, and riot police trying to get them out. These episodes were recurring at the height of the crisis, and they were igniting mass protests, and they were driving a lot of insurrectionary wave, is the only way I can describe it. It wasn't just about housing. Of course, there were a lot of mass movements around austerity cuts and against corruption and all sorts of things that were happening at the same time. But housing was definitely the tip of the spear of that whole cycle, and for good reasons, because it was also the main cause of the whole thing.
Thank you. I think these sort of vignettes of what was going on are really interesting to hear about. And it kind of brings me to my next question, to both of you, actually. Given that housing is a sort of peculiar form of modern globalized capitalism, but we know that capitalism, including financialized capitalism, also has localized structures. If you had to sort of compare the housing crises across the world, and I know this is a sort of very big question, what do you think are the mediating factors that maybe differentiate one kind of area or one kind of region or state from another? Are we looking at social welfare systems, the financial systems? Where do you think the differences might come into play?
Something that I love about the Javier's book is the way that he like theoretically conveys the point that housing crisis or a housing question is a necessary part of every capitalist society. And I think he deals with it like a very highly abstract and theoretical level, and then he grounds it in through the historical experience of Spain. I think that the main lesson that can be drawn from Javier's book is that even if a housing question is a necessary element of every capitalist society, the specific manifestation it takes, the way it phenomenally shows up in a given society, depends on the institutional environment or institutional order that articulates it. Even if there are like different logics, different dynamics, which necessarily lead to some sort of tension or underlying problem around housing, it can take different manifestations. It can support different actors. It can have different social consequences depending on which specific institutions are in place and how they articulate these different groups, which might have sometimes mostly antagonistic interests, but which take place in the same society. So I don't know if Javier wants to expand a bit more on those different dynamics that you identify around housing and why, and in essence, why a housing crisis is a necessary element of every capitalist society.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. He sets them up for me so well. That is completely right. The main thrust of the theoretical argument of my book is that there is something about capital accumulation through housing assets that I think grates against the development of capitalist production over the long run. In my view, there's two distinct logics of capital accumulation that are intertwined, and they're necessarily intertwined in capitalist society. One is capitalist production, which involves the production of commodities in a competitive environment, and over the long run, it leads to increases in productivity to make those commodities more cost efficient, and therefore you can sell them better, sell more of them, right? So the example here would be during the Industrial Revolution, the expansion of textiles, the production of foodstuffs, and today we could see the construction of solar panels in a more cost-efficient way. So that is capitalist production. It is competitive, it is based on productivity, expanding output, and it has a deflationary long-term logic because it tends to lower prices over time. As productivity increases and competition cuts into profit rates, prices go down. The other form of accumulation is in some ways the mirror opposite of this, and that is rent extraction. Now, rent extraction involves doing it the other way around. It's instead of increasing output in a competitive manner, is about hoarding scarce assets in a monopolistic manner and trying to raise the price of the commodity or the service that you're offering as much as possible. To put it in more mainstream terms, one involves value generation, the other one involves value capture. Housing is torn between both things, as most commodities are, by the way. That is an argument I make in the book. But this comes out in the case of housing is particularly pronounced because housing is a landed asset, and land is the quintessential rent-bearing asset. In capitalist societies, the more that these societies have developed, population tends to agglomerate around certain urban centers because that's where the opportunities for employment are, and that drives up the worth of a scarce commodity, which is land, and then that scarcity and that inflationary character passes on to the building asset that is attached onto the land. And that is why in the same economic system you can have basic subsistence commodities, clothing, textiles, etc., falling in real prices, or relative prices at least, and then housing witnessing a real cost increase secularly over time. Now, the thing about capitalist production is that by making things cheaper relative to income, it liberates the disposable income that households have to consume more, and that animates the growth of the system. Housing is doing the opposite, is eating into the disposable income of people, and it means that it is narrowing the market for capitalist products. So this is an abstract schema that I lay out in the book, and I say that these two logics of accumulation are always intertwined in complex ways, and states and the role of housing policy is essentially to try to manage this tension in some way, or to reorganize it so as to deflect the pressures and the contradictions of this relationship towards different channels. And in the case of Spain, in the run-up to the crisis, obviously the book goes all the way back to the 19th century, but in the run-up to the crisis, what you had was essentially a system that relied on homeowners and on providing cheap finance, and speculators reigned free, so that both big rentiers, big speculators, and middle-class homeowning petty rentiers, as I call them, or little speculators, they kind of form a political-economic alliance, both politically and economically, in terms of relying on the appreciating value of their assets to derive their income. So obviously, big property developers and financiers, they were capturing value from the appreciating value of housing assets, and then middle-class homeowners, they were the buyers, and simultaneously getting part of the rent by banking on being able to sell it on to the next buyer at a higher price. So what you see here is a kind of, a rentier formation that goes into 2008 that is fueled by credit, because income is stagnating, as Pedro was saying earlier. Credit is what is driving the whole thing. But unless income keeps up with the necessary debt repayments, what you'll have is a withdrawal of consumption down the line, or you burn it through your savings, and then the cuts into your consumption come into the picture. So that is what happens in 2008. That this contradiction comes into a head, and then the contradiction between rent extraction and capitalist production comes out into the open. So in the decade prior to the crash, millions of homes, I think 6 million homes were built since the late 90s, and hundreds of thousands in excess of what real demand was. But the availability of cheap credit meant that developers could build more houses than they were needed, because credit was keeping up prices going. The line kept going up, because the more that you can indebt yourself, the more you will be able to bid up prices for the home that you want, right? So people were taking on more and more debt to keep up with this wave, because otherwise you might not have a house. And that meant that it's a bit like the road runner. The end of the road was reached, and then we were still like running over thin air. And then at some point we realized that actually there wasn't enough real income to pay back this debt, and the whole edifice collapsed. So that was the arrangement that we had in the neoliberal era. In other periods, you've had different arrangements. And I think if you want to understand that better, Pedro's book is a fantastic exploration of this. Capitalism, Institution, and Social Orders, also available on Routledge. And I recommend anyone to read it too, by the way.
Thank you. I think this brings me to my final question to you both, which is, what is to be done? So I think your analyses are superb. They're persuasive. You see the contradictions, you see the crisis in play, you see the reasons for all of this. And where do we go from here? What do you think? Who should do what?
I must confess that I'm not a housing expert, so most of what I know, Javier among them. I guess that the highly ambitious answer would be like the transcendence of capitalist society and prevent accumulation to take place through housing, because otherwise certain dynamics of exclusion are going to be necessarily reproduced in some way or another, or at least certain systemic imbalances, which then will wave to dynamics which will be awful or awkward. But absent post-capitalist transformation, measures like massive investment in public social housing, right, either run through the state or through cooperatives, much tighter control of the private rental market, measures like to support people to pay for dwellings when they lack high enough wages or other sources of income. But in the end, I think that the main lesson that I take and that can be taken from Javier's book is that even all these measures do matter. They do make a social impact, and they improve and they ameliorate the life chances of certain groups of population, ideally the most excluded or most harmed. But in the end, there will always be some underlying tension which can be channeled or managed, but can never be abolished or averted or done away once and for all. So I guess like this interplay between the palliative measures in the short and middle run and a more ambitious longer run strategic outlook. I think that's something that I love about this book, and that's where I retain and take with me. I don't know if Javi wants to add something to it.
Yeah, I think he captures well the spirit of my argument. I think that obviously reformist social democratic measures are desirable and necessary and quite obvious, but there are obviously contradictions that come with that too. So, for example, if we were to institute rent controls or some kind of price controls on housing, as many countries did in the middle decades of the 20th century, that's all good and well, but it might prompt developers and private for-profit providers withdrawing from the market because it's no longer worth it to them, or they engage in an active capital strike to sabotage that policy and force states to revert it, which is also very common. It's something that we have seen in the past. Now, these are pretty reformist measures, but they will get blowback. The question is not so much do you do them or not do them, it's do you have a plan to respond to the escalation that will come from that, to respond blow by blow to this escalating environment. So if a country decides to embark on reformist measures of this sort, which I think are good and necessary, unless you have a mass movement leveraging those measures and backing the government that is introducing them, the government will be quite isolated in the face of elite blowback. So the importance here is that you do not need to neglect the pressure of the street to keep you going in this direction. So that's one. And second, sooner or later, I think this hypothetical state will have to face the prospect of having to substitute capital in the provision of housing, because it's not enough to just control prices. If then private investors withdraw from the market, then housing will still need to be provided and you need to fulfill that role. So that is a scenario that is very black and white. Other measures like, as Pedro was saying, some form of social housing, which is a term that doesn't mean very much. It generally means some kind of below market price housing. It serves to take the edge off the market. It means that residents have options. They don't have to take any extortive prices that developers and landlords demand of them. And what I think that we cannot rely on at all is the typical measure that we have now, which is governments essentially subsidizing debt and mortgages for people because it's just a subsidy for rentiers. So if you help young people take out mortgages, that just means that their financial rentiers, the bank, is just going to take the benefit of that. Or the same thing with rent prices. In reality, it's not a subsidy to residents, it's a subsidy to rentiers. So that kind of, I think, lays out the terms of engagement. I think at the end of the day, what we need is to lift as much as possible housing from rentier predation. And it will take different forms depending on the country. Obviously, we can all here cast wishes into the wind, but people are operating in an institutional, legal, political environment, and they have to navigate the instruments that they have at hand. But the principle, I think, is clear. It's about turning housing as much as possible into the utility that it is. It is a space for residence and for reproduction, and it should be lifted out of the space of speculation and rent extraction.
Well, thank you, Javier. Thank you, Pedro, for a really engaging discussion. And I think there's lots to say because, as you say, the crisis is not over in many countries and it's ongoing. And it's ongoing also because it is a systemic crisis of capitalism, of course, as Pedro, you pointed out. So this is a long-term battle, as it were, for the right to housing and something we all need, but in different ways, of course, across the world. So with this, I would like to thank both of you. And hopefully there'll be further grounds for engagement going forward and possibly some more optimistic news coming our way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva. Thanks, Pedro.
Thank you very much, both. It's been a pleasure.